The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop in front of the weathered timber building, and Beatrice Ashford tumbled out into the frozen mud of Gila City, Arizona. Her worn traveling dress soaked through, and her fingers numb inside her thin gloves. December of 1882 had brought an unusual cold snap to the desert territory, and the biting wind that swept down from the mountains carried needles of ice that stung her cheeks. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia with nothing but a carpet bag containing 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, and the deed to a piece of land she had never seen, inherited from an uncle she barely remembered. The advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer had promised opportunity in the frontier territories, and with her father's debts mounting and her prospects for marriage dwindling at 23, she had taken the desperate gamble that would either save her or destroy her completely. The main street of Gila City stretched before her like a promise written in dust and disappointment. False-fronted buildings leaned against each other as if seeking warmth, their painted signs faded by the relentless desert sun. A general store, a saloon called the Desert Rose, a blacksmith shop with smoke rising from its chimney, and at the far end, a small church with a crooked steeple that seemed to reach toward heaven with uncertain faith. The few people moving along the wooden sidewalks hunched against the cold, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. This was nothing like the bustling streets of Philadelphia, nothing like the life she had known with its predictable rhythms and social expectations. This was raw and unforgiving, and she was utterly alone. "That will be $2 for the trunk, miss," the stagecoach driver called down from his perch, his beard crusted with ice. Beatrice fumbled in her reticule, counting out the precious coins that represented the last of her savings. The driver hauled down her battered trunk and set it in the mud with a thud that seemed to echo her own sense of finality. Then he was gone, the stagecoach disappearing in a cloud of frozen dust, and she stood alone on the frontier with winter closing in around her. "You look lost." The voice came from behind her, deep and rough as gravel, and she spun around to find a man standing in the shadow of the general store's overhang. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that filled out his sheepskin coat, and a face that seemed carved from the same red rock that dotted the surrounding landscape. His hat was pulled low, but she could see eyes the color of desert sage watching her with an expression she could not quite read. There was something lonely in those eyes, something that recognized her own displacement. "I am looking for the land office," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the cold that made her teeth want to chatter. "I have inherited property here, and I need to register the deed." "Land office is closed until spring," he said, stepping into the weak winter sunlight. "Mr. Henderson went back east to visit his daughter, won't return until March at the earliest." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her impractical traveling dress and the trunk that held all her worldly possessions. "You planning to stay the winter?" The question hung in the frozen air between them, and Beatrice felt the full weight of her situation settle onto her shoulders. She had spent every dollar she could scrape together to reach this desolate place, and she had nowhere else to go. Her father's creditors had seized their Philadelphia home, and her younger sister had married a clerk and moved to Boston with barely enough room for herself, let alone a spinster sister with no prospects. The land in Gila City was her only hope, her only claim to independence in a world that offered women precious few options. "I have no choice," she said simply, and something shifted in his expression, a softening around the hard edges. "Name is Xavier Zimmerman," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I run a cattle operation about 5 miles north of town. Been working this territory for near about 8 years now." He glanced at her trunk, then back at her face. "That uncle of yours, the one who left you the land." "That would be Thomas Ashford. You knew him." Hope flared in her chest, a warmth against the bitter cold. "Knew of him. He had a small ranch about 3 miles west of here up against the foothills. Raised horses mostly, kept to himself." Xavier's expression grew somber. "He died last summer. Heat stroke, they said. By the time anyone found him, the place had already started going to ruin. I am sorry for your loss." Beatrice had not known her uncle well enough to grieve him properly, but she felt a pang of sadness for this lonely man who had died alone in the wilderness. "Is the house still standing?" Xavier shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Standing is a generous word. The roof has some holes and the windows are mostly gone. It would need a lot of work before winter, and winter has already arrived." He paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal debate. "Look, I do not make a habit of interfering in other people's business, but you cannot stay out there. You would freeze to death before New Year." "Then where do you suggest I go?" she asked, hearing the edge of desperation in her own voice. "I have very little money, and I cannot afford to stay at a hotel for months while I wait for spring." Xavier looked past her down the street, his jaw working as if he was chewing over a difficult decision. When he finally spoke, his voice was gruff, almost embarrassed. "I have a ranch house with extra rooms. My foreman and 2 ranch hands have their own bunkhouse, and I have been living alone in the main house since my mother died 3 years back. You could stay there, work for your keep by cooking and keeping house. The arrangement would be entirely proper. You would have your own room, and my men would serve as chaperones." The offer was so unexpected, so improbable that Beatrice could only stare at him. In Philadelphia, such an arrangement would have been scandalous beyond redemption, but this was not Philadelphia. This was the frontier, where survival trumped propriety and the normal rules of society bent under the weight of necessity. "Why would you help me?" she asked, needing to understand his motivations before she placed herself in his power. Xavier met her gaze directly, and she saw no deception in those sage-colored eyes, only a bone-deep weariness and something else, something that looked almost like hope. "Because I have been alone too long," he said quietly. "Because this land breaks people who try to face it by themselves. Because 8 years ago, someone helped me when I had nothing, and I figure it is time to pass that kindness forward." The wind gusted down the street, cutting through her inadequate dress and making the decision for her. She could refuse his offer and maintain her pride while she froze to death in a broken-down ranch house, or she could accept his help and give herself a chance to survive until spring. When she thought of it that way, there was really no choice at all. "I accept your offer, Mr. Zimmerman," she said, extending her hand in the manner of a business agreement. "And I promise you will not regret your kindness." His large hand enveloped hers, rough with calluses but surprisingly gentle. "Call me Xavier," he said. "And welcome to Arizona territory, Miss Ashford. Let me get your trunk loaded onto my wagon, and we will head to the ranch before this cold gets any worse." The ride to Xavier's ranch took nearly an hour, the wagon jolting over frozen ruts while the wind howled across the open desert. Beatrice huddled in her inadequate coat, trying not to let her teeth chatter as Xavier drove the horses with steady competence. He did not speak much during the journey, but his silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man accustomed to solitude, who had learned to find peace in the vast emptiness of the landscape. The ranch appeared gradually, emerging from the desert like something conjured from the wind itself. A sturdy timber and adobe house sat at the center of a complex of buildings, with corrals spreading out to one side and a barn and bunkhouse on the other. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney, and she could see cattle scattered across the valley beyond, dark shapes against the pale winter grass. It was isolated and harsh, but there was something honest about it, something that appealed to a part of her she had not known existed until this moment. Xavier helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong on her waist, and she felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. He carried her trunk as if it weighed nothing, leading her up the steps to the wide front porch and through the heavy wooden door. The interior of the house was dim and cold, but she could see it had good bones. A large main room with a stone fireplace dominated the front, with a kitchen area and what looked like 2 bedrooms branching off to the sides. A ladder led to a loft space above. "I will get a fire going," Xavier said, setting her trunk down near one of the bedroom doors. "That room there is yours. It was my mother's. The bedding should still be good, though it might smell a bit of cedar from the chest." He moved to the fireplace with efficient movements, stacking kindling and logs with the practice of someone who had performed the task 1,000 times. Within minutes, flames were crackling to life, and blessed warmth began to seep into the room. Beatrice stood awkwardly in the center of the space, unsure of her place in this strange new world. Xavier straightened from the fire and seemed to notice her uncertainty. "I know this is not what you expected when you came west," he said. "But I meant what I said about this being a proper arrangement. You will have your privacy, and I will expect nothing from you except honest work. If you cook and keep the house, we will call it even for room and board." "That seems more than fair," she said, finding her voice at last. "Though I should warn you, my cooking skills are adequate but not exceptional. In Philadelphia, we had a cook." The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Out here, adequate is better than exceptional. We are not looking for fancy meals, just hot food that sticks to the ribs." He moved toward the door, then paused. "I need to go check on the cattle and talk to my men. Make yourself at home and I will be back before dark. There is food in the pantry if you get hungry." Then he was gone, leaving her alone in the house that smelled of wood smoke and solitude. Beatrice stood for a moment, letting the reality of her situation sink in. She was in Arizona territory, in the home of a man she had met less than 2 hours ago, with winter closing in and no way to leave until spring. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, and she realized that for the first time in her 23 years, she was truly free from the expectations and constraints that had defined her entire life. She explored her new room and found it simple but clean, with a sturdy bed covered in quilts that smelled of cedar, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a small window that looked out toward the mountains. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses in the narrow wardrobe and placing her mother's Bible on the bedside table. Then she ventured into the kitchen to take stock of what she had to work with. The pantry was better stocked than she had expected, with sacks of flour and cornmeal, jars of preserved vegetables and fruit, dried beans, salt pork, and coffee. A door at the back of the kitchen led to a root cellar where potatoes and onions were stored in neat bins. It was clear that Xavier was organized and practical, a man who planned ahead and took care of his resources. She found a large pot and began to assemble a simple stew, cutting up salt pork and onions, adding dried beans that she had set to soak, and seasoning it with the limited herbs she could find. As she worked, her hands remembering the basic skills her mother had taught her before the family had risen in prosperity enough to hire staff, she found herself thinking about Xavier Zimmerman. He was unlike any man she had known in Philadelphia, where the gentlemen of her acquaintance had been concerned with social standing and business connections. There was something raw and genuine about him, something shaped by this harsh landscape into a form both harder and more honest than the polished manners of Eastern society. And those eyes, those sage-colored eyes that held such loneliness, haunted her in a way she could not quite explain. The afternoon light was fading when she heard boots on the porch, and Xavier came through the door with a gust of cold air. His face was reddened from the wind, and snow had begun to dust his shoulders. He stopped when he saw the table set for two and smelled the stew simmering on the stove. "I did not expect you to have supper ready so soon," he said, removing his hat and coat with careful movements, as if he was unused to being attended to in his own home. "It is nothing fancy," she said, ladling the stew into bowls, "but it should be filling." They sat across from each other at the rough-hewn table, and for a few minutes, the only sound was the clink of spoons against bowls. Xavier ate with the focus of a man who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure, but after a few bites, he looked up at her with something like surprise. "This is good," he said. "Really good. You do not need to flatter me," she said, but she felt a flush of pleasure at his words. "I do not flatter," he said bluntly. "I have been eating my own cooking for 3 years, and it is about as exciting as eating boot leather. This is the best meal I have had in longer than I care to admit." They fell into conversation then, tentative at first but growing easier as the meal progressed. He told her about his ranch, how he had come to Arizona Territory from Texas after his father died, seeking a fresh start and a place where he could build something of his own. He spoke of the challenges of raising cattle in the desert, the constant battle against drought and heat, predators and disease. His mother had come with him, a tough frontier woman who had adapted to the harsh life with determination. But her heart had given out one summer night, and he had buried her on a hillside overlooking the valley. "She always said I needed to find a good woman and start a family," Xavier said, staring into his coffee cup. "But out here, decent women are rare, and the ones who come usually do not stay long. The loneliness and the hardship drive them back east before a year is out." "Is that why you never married?" Beatrice asked, then immediately worried she had overstepped, but Xavier did not seem offended. "Partly that. Partly because I was too busy building this place to think much about courting. And partly because I never met anyone who seemed to fit here, who understood what this life requires." He looked up at her then, and something in his gaze made her heart skip. "What about you? A woman your age from a good family, I would have expected you to be married with children by now." Beatrice felt the familiar sting of shame, but out here in this wild place, it seemed less important somehow. "I had a fiancé once," she said. "A banker's son, very respectable, but he broke off the engagement when my father's business failed. He said he could not afford to marry into a family with debt and scandal." She met Xavier's eyes defiantly. "I realized then that I had never loved him, and he had certainly never loved me. We were just playing the roles society expected of us." "Sounds like you had a lucky escape," Xavier said. "A man who would abandon a woman because of money is not worth having." "That is a refreshingly practical view," she said with a small smile. "The frontier makes you practical," he said, "or it kills you. There is not much room for anything in between." Over the next few weeks, Beatrice settled into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for Xavier and his men, who would ride out to check on the cattle and repair fences and perform the 100 tasks required to keep a ranch running through winter. She spent her days cleaning the house that had accumulated years of bachelor neglect, washing clothes in the big copper tub, and preparing meals that grew more elaborate as she became familiar with the available ingredients. In the evenings, she and Xavier would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence as the wind howled outside and the temperature plummeted. Xavier's ranch hands were a study in contrasts. The foreman, a grizzled man named Tom Briggs who had been working cattle since before the Civil War, treated her with formal courtesy and kept a protective eye on the arrangement. The two younger hands, brothers named Danny and Sam Fletcher, were barely into their 20s and clearly smitten with her, though they were too shy and respectful to do more than stumble over their words when she brought meals out to the bunkhouse. But it was Xavier himself who occupied more and more of her thoughts. She found herself watching for his return each evening, listening for the sound of his boots on the porch. She noticed small things about him. The way he always checked the fire before retiring to make sure she would stay warm through the night. The way he left books on the table for her to read. The way his face softened when she laughed at something he said. He was patient and kind, but there was a strength in him that made her feel safe for the first time since her father had died. Christmas came and went with a quiet celebration. Just the two of them in the ranch house while the men celebrated in the bunkhouse. Beatrice had managed to make a simple cake with dried fruit, and Xavier surprised her with a gift, a warm wool shawl he had purchased on his last trip to town. "I noticed you were cold," he said, his face slightly flushed as he handed her the wrapped package. "Figured you could use something warmer than those Eastern clothes." She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, feeling the soft warmth of the wool and something warmer still in her chest. "Thank you, Xavier. This is the kindest gift anyone has given me in a long time." "You have earned it," he said. "This house feels like a home again because of you." Their eyes met across the firelight, and Beatrice felt something pass between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. She knew in that moment that what she felt for this rough, lonely cowboy was not gratitude or convenience, but something far more dangerous and profound. She was falling in love with him, and the realization terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. January brought bitter cold and snow that was rare for the desert, but not unheard of during particularly harsh winters. The cattle huddled in the valley, and the men worked from dawn to dusk to keep them fed and protected. Xavier came home each night exhausted, his face lined with worry about losing stock to the cold, and Beatrice found herself taking on more responsibilities, helping Tom with the bookkeeping and inventory, learning to treat minor injuries when Sam cut his hand on barbed wire. One night in late January, a blizzard swept down from the mountains with terrifying speed. Xavier and Tom were out checking on a herd in the northern pasture when the storm hit, and as the hours passed with no sign of their return, Beatrice felt panic rising in her throat. Danny and Sam wanted to go out searching, but she knew that would only put more lives at risk. All they could do was wait and pray. It was nearly midnight when she heard horses on the porch, and she ran to the door to find Xavier and Tom stumbling in, half frozen and covered in snow. Tom headed straight for the bunkhouse, but Xavier collapsed into a chair by the fire, his lips blue with cold and his hands shaking so hard he could not remove his gloves. Beatrice did not hesitate. She knelt beside him and began working his frozen gloves off gently, then his boots, then his coat. She fetched blankets and hot coffee, wrapping him in warmth and holding the cup to his lips when his hands shook too much to hold it himself. Gradually, color returned to his face, and the violent shaking subsided. "I thought you might not make it back," she whispered, and was shocked to feel tears streaming down her face. Xavier looked at her with wonder, raising one hand to gently wipe away her tears. "Beatrice," he said, his voice rough from cold and emotion, "I had to make it back. I had to come home to you." The air between them seemed to shimmer with unspoken feeling, and then his hand was cupping her cheek, and she was leaning into his touch, and his lips were on hers in a kiss that tasted of coffee and snow, and something that felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Xavier's eyes held a mixture of longing and uncertainty. "I am sorry," he said. "That was inappropriate. You are a guest in my home, and I took advantage." "You did not take advantage of anything," she said firmly, her hand covering his where it still rested against her cheek. "Xavier, I have not felt this way about anyone in my entire life. What I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude or convenience. I love you." The words hung in the air between them, brave and terrifying and absolutely true. Xavier stared at her as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing, and then a smile broke across his face, transforming his features from severe to joyful. "Beatrice Ashford, I have been half in love with you since the moment you tumbled out of that stagecoach looking lost and determined at the same time," he said. "I did not think I would ever find someone who could love this life, who could love me, but here you are, and I cannot imagine facing another day without you." She kissed him again, longer and deeper this time, feeling the rightness of it in every fiber of her being. When they finally drew apart, she rested her forehead against his, both of them smiling like fools. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now I do this properly," Xavier said. He slid from the chair to kneel on the floor, taking both her hands in his. "Beatrice, will you marry me? Will you stay here and build a life with me in this wild, beautiful, impossible place?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes to everything." They were married in February by the circuit preacher who passed through Gila City once a month. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church with the crooked steeple, with Tom Briggs and Danny and Sam Fletcher standing as witnesses, along with a handful of other ranchers and townspeople who had become friendly acquaintances over the winter months. Beatrice wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that Xavier said matched her eyes, and Xavier wore a new suit he had ordered special from the general store. When he said, "I do," in his deep, steady voice, Beatrice felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. They held a small celebration at the ranch afterward, with food and music and dancing in the main room they had pushed the furniture aside to clear. Tom played a fiddle he produced from somewhere, and Danny and Sam took turns dancing with the few women who had attended, ranchers' wives and daughters who welcomed Beatrice into their small frontier community with warmth and practical advice. But the best part was when the guests had finally left, and she and Xavier were alone at last, standing together on the porch watching the stars blaze overhead in the clear desert night. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his solid warmth. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "I am happier than I ever dreamed possible," she said truthfully. "When I came to Arizona, I thought I was just trying to survive. I never imagined I would find a home, a real home in every sense of the word." "You are my home," Xavier said, turning her in his arms to face him. "You are the home I have been seeking all these years without even knowing it." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that left them both breathless and amazed. Xavier was gentle and patient, mindful of her inexperience, and Beatrice found herself responding to his touch with a passion she had not known she possessed. They made love slowly, learning each other's bodies and hearts, and afterward lay tangled together in the bed that had been Xavier's alone but was now theirs together. Spring arrived gradually, the desert transforming from frozen wasteland to a riot of color as wildflowers bloomed, and the cattle grew sleek on new grass. Beatrice rode out with Xavier to inspect her inherited property, and found it was every bit as dilapidated as he had warned. But standing in the ruins with his arm around her waist, she could see the potential in it. We could fix this place up, Xavier said thoughtfully. Maybe expand our operation. Use this land for horses like your uncle did. The valley between our properties would make good grazing. Our properties, she said, liking the sound of it. Our land, our home, our life. They spent the spring and summer working to build their future, repairing the old house and fences, purchasing horses to start a breeding program, expanding the cattle herd. Tom proved invaluable with his experience, and Danny and Sam grew into capable ranch hands who could handle more responsibility. Beatrice threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm, learning to ride well enough to help with the work, keeping the books, even learning to handle a rifle after a close encounter with a rattlesnake convinced Xavier that she needed to be able to defend herself. By the time fall arrived, Beatrice knew she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, the small signs her body gave her unmistakable, but she waited until she was certain before telling Xavier. She chose a quiet evening after supper, when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "Xavier, I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat belly. "We are going to have a baby." His eyes went wide with shock, then joy, then something that looked almost like fear. "A baby? Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be," she said. "I think it will come sometime in March or April." Xavier pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart pounding against her chest. "I am going to be a father," he said wonderingly. "We are going to be a family." "We already are a family," she said, kissing his cheek. "But yes, we are going to expand our operation." The months of pregnancy were not easy. Beatrice suffered from terrible nausea in the early months that left her pale and weak, and Xavier hovered over her with anxious concern until she finally snapped at him that she was not made of glass. As her belly grew, the physical challenges mounted, and she found herself missing the simple ability to ride a horse or bend over without grunting. But through it all, Xavier was beside her, supportive and loving, talking to her belly at night and feeling for the baby's kicks with wonder on his face. They spent the winter preparing for the baby's arrival, converting the loft space into a proper nursery, ordering a cradle from the carpenter in town, and washing tiny clothes that Beatrice had sewn during the long evenings by the fire. The ranchers' wives rallied around her, bringing gifts and advice, sharing their own stories of childbirth on the frontier with a frankness that would have shocked her Philadelphia sensibilities, but now just made her grateful for their practical wisdom. The baby came in late March of 1884, arriving in the middle of a spring thunderstorm that turned the desert into a muddy mess. The birth was long and difficult, with Xavier pacing the main room in agony while Tom's wife, Martha, who had delivered half the babies in the county, attended Beatrice in the bedroom. When the baby's first cry finally split the air, Xavier burst through the door to find Beatrice exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "It is a boy," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "A healthy, perfect boy." Xavier approached the bed with reverence, looking down at his son with an expression of awe that brought tears to Beatrice's eyes. The baby had a shock of dark hair and Xavier's strong features already visible in miniature. When Xavier carefully took him in his arms, the infant seemed impossibly small against his father's broad chest. "Hello, son," Xavier said softly. "Welcome to your home." They named him Thomas Xavier Zimmerman, after Tom Briggs, who had been such a faithful friend and foreman, and the baby quickly became the center of their world. Xavier was an attentive father, waking in the night to help with feedings, walking the floor with Thomas when he was fussy, staring at his tiny son with an expression of wonder that never quite faded. Beatrice adjusted to motherhood with the same determination she had brought to everything else in her frontier life. It was exhausting and demanding and occasionally overwhelming, but when she looked at Thomas nursing at her breast or sleeping peacefully in his cradle, she felt a completeness that made every sacrifice worthwhile. The ranch prospered over the next few years. Their horse breeding program gained a reputation for quality stock, and the cattle herd grew steadily. They built an addition onto the house, adding a proper parlor and another bedroom for future children. Tom retired from foreman duties but stayed on as a valued advisor, while Sam Fletcher stepped into the role with competence and pride. Danny had fallen in love with a girl from town and married her, bringing his bride to live in a small house they built on the ranch property. Thomas grew from infant to toddler to a sturdy little boy with his father's eyes and his mother's determination. He learned to walk chasing chickens in the yard and spoke his first word, horse, while sitting on his father's lap watching the animals in the corral. Beatrice found herself pregnant again when Thomas was 3, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Margaret, arrived in the fall of 1887 with far less drama than her brother, slipping into the world as if eager to join the family. She had Beatrice's delicate features and Xavier's dark hair, and from the beginning she was a happy, contented baby who seemed to find joy in everything around her. With 2 children and a thriving ranch, life was busy and full. Beatrice often thought back to that frozen December day when she had arrived in Gila City with nothing but a carpetbag and desperate hope. She had come to the frontier expecting hardship and survival, and instead she had found love and belonging, a home not in the physical structures around her but in the people who filled them with warmth and laughter. One evening in the spring of 1890, when Thomas was 6 and Sarah was 2, Beatrice and Xavier sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard as the sun set. Thomas was teaching Sarah to identify different birds, pointing up at the sky with serious concentration while his little sister tried to repeat the words he said. The scene was so ordinary and yet so precious that Beatrice felt her throat tighten with emotion. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, taking her hand in his. "I am thinking about that day you found me standing in the mud in Gila City," she said. "About how terrified I was and how you offered me kindness when you had no reason to." "I had every reason to," Xavier said, lifting her hand to his lips. "I just did not know it yet. You told me that winter brought me to the frontier," she continued, "but it was not the season that brought me here. It was fate, or providence, or whatever name you want to give to the force that brings 2 people together when they need each other most. And you told me, that first night we admitted our feelings, that I was the home you had been seeking," Xavier said. "But you had it backward, Beatrice. You are the home I had been seeking all my life without knowing it. This ranch, this land, these buildings, none of it meant anything until you were here to share it with me. We are each other's home," Beatrice said simply, "and we have built something beautiful together." Xavier pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence as the desert twilight deepened around them. Thomas ran over with Sarah toddling behind him, both children clamoring for their parents' attention, and the moment of quiet reflection gave way to the cheerful chaos of family life. The years continued to roll past, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growth of their children. Thomas grew into a responsible young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, learning everything Xavier could teach him about cattle and horses and the land they worked. Sarah proved to have a head for numbers and began helping her mother with the account books as soon as she was old enough to understand them. In 1895, when Thomas was 11 and Sarah was 7, Beatrice found herself pregnant again, much to everyone's surprise. She was nearly 40 years old, and they had assumed their family was complete. But the baby that arrived that fall was another healthy boy, whom they named Daniel William. He was a surprise and a blessing, arriving with a fierce cry that announced his presence to the world, and his older siblings doted on him with the pride of much older and wiser children. Tom Briggs passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1897, at the age of 73, and they buried him on the hillside next to Xavier's mother, overlooking the valley he had helped to build. It was a loss that hit the whole family hard, but particularly Xavier, who had considered Tom not just a foreman but a second father. At the funeral, standing beside the grave with his arm around Beatrice and his children gathered close, Xavier spoke of loyalty and friendship, and the bonds that men forge when they work side by side in service of something greater than themselves. The ranch continued to grow and prosper into the new century. Thomas married a rancher's daughter named Emily in 1900, and they built a house on the southern portion of the property, starting their own family and continuing the legacy Xavier and Beatrice had begun. Sarah surprised everyone by announcing she wanted to attend normal school to become a teacher, and though Xavier worried about her leaving the ranch, Beatrice supported her daughter's ambition wholeheartedly. Sarah returned 2 years later with a teaching certificate and opened a small school in Gila City, educating the children of ranchers and miners and shop owners who desperately needed the opportunities education could provide. Daniel grew into a young man who inherited his mother's love of reading and his father's strength, a thoughtful soul who was equally comfortable discussing literature and breaking horses. In 1910, when he was 15, he announced his intention to study veterinary medicine, wanting to combine his love for animals with scientific knowledge. Xavier and Beatrice scraped together the money to send him to school in Tucson, proud of their son's ambitions even as they missed his presence on the ranch. By 1915, Xavier was 60 years old, his dark hair gone mostly silver, and Beatrice was 56. Her beauty matured into something even more striking than her youth had promised. They had been married for 33 years, had raised 3 children, had built a ranch that was now one of the most successful in the territory, which had become the state of Arizona in 1912. One evening in late spring, almost exactly 33 years after their wedding, they sat together on the porch they had sat on countless times before. The desert was in bloom, carpeted with wildflowers that turned the landscape into a painter's palette of color. Thomas and Emily's children, their grandchildren, were playing in the yard under the watchful eye of their parents. Sarah was visiting from town with her husband, a kind man who ran the general store and supported his wife's teaching career. Daniel was home from veterinary school for the summer, taller and more confident than when he had left. "We have built a good life," Xavier said, his hand finding Beatrice's as naturally as breathing. "We have built the best life," Beatrice corrected. "I cannot imagine what my existence would have been if I had stayed in Philadelphia, if I had never taken that desperate gamble and come west." "You would have survived," Xavier said. "You are the strongest person I know. You would have found a way." "Maybe," Beatrice acknowledged. "But I would have survived without truly living. I would have existed without ever knowing what it meant to be fully, completely alive." She turned to face him, seeing in his weathered face the same man who had offered her kindness all those years ago in the frozen mud of Gila City. "You gave me that, Xavier. You gave me a life worth living, a love worth fighting for, a home worth building." "We gave that to each other," Xavier said. "When I told you that you were the home I had been seeking, I meant it with everything in me. And 33 years later, it is still true. You are still my home, Beatrice. You always will be. They kissed then, a gentle kiss that held 33 years of shared experience, of challenges overcome and joys celebrated, of a love that had only deepened and strengthened with time. Around them, their family continued with the business of living, their children and grandchildren creating new memories in the home that Xavier and Beatrice had built together. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple, Beatrice leaned against Xavier's shoulder and felt the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The winter that had brought her to the frontier had been harsh and unforgiving, but it had also brought her to the greatest love of her life, to the man who had seen her not as a burden or an obligation, but as a partner and an equal. Thomas called out that supper was ready, and the family began to gather, moving toward the house in the easy manner of people who belong together. Xavier stood and offered Beatrice his hand, pulling her to her feet with the same gentleness he had shown her that first night when he had nursed her through his near-freezing experience in the blizzard. "Ready?" he asked, and she knew he was not just asking about supper. "Always," she said, taking his hand. "As long as I am with you, I am ready for anything." They walked into the house together, into the warmth and light and laughter of the family they had created, the home they had built from nothing but determination and love. Behind them, the desert night descended, vast and beautiful and full of stars, a reminder of the wilderness that had tested them and the love that had sustained them through every challenge. The years ahead would bring their own joys and sorrows, the inevitable losses that came with age, the joy of watching grandchildren grow and great-grandchildren arrive. Xavier and Beatrice would face it all together, just as they had faced every challenge since that winter day in 1882, when a desperate woman and a lonely cowboy had found in each other the home they had both been seeking. On quiet evenings, they would return to their porch, to the place where so many important moments had unfolded, and sit together in comfortable silence. Sometimes they would talk about the past, sharing memories and laughing at the way time had changed their perspectives. Sometimes they would talk about the future, making plans for the ranch and speculating about what their children and grandchildren might accomplish. But mostly they would just sit together, hands intertwined, watching the sun set over the land they loved, secure in the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it together. In 1920, Xavier suffered a heart attack while checking on cattle in the northern pasture. Thomas found him and brought him home, where Beatrice nursed him with the same fierce determination she had brought to every challenge in their life together. Daniel, now a successful veterinarian with his own practice in Tucson, came home to help care for his father, combining his medical knowledge with his deep love for the man who had raised him. Xavier recovered slowly, forced by his weakened heart to step back from the demanding physical work of ranching. It frustrated him initially, this sudden limitation of his body, but Beatrice reminded him that they had raised 3 capable children who could carry on the work they had begun. "We have built something that will outlast us," she told him as they sat together in the sunshine, Xavier propped up with pillows and looking stronger each day. "The ranch will continue because we taught our children to love it and care for it. Our legacy is not just in the land but in the people we raised. When did you become so wise?" Xavier asked with a smile that was only slightly diminished by his illness. "I learned from the best," Beatrice said, kissing his forehead. "From a cowboy who taught me that strength is not just about what your body can do, but about what your heart can endure." Xavier made a full recovery, or as full as could be expected for a man in his mid-60s who had lived a life of hard physical labor. He became an advisor rather than an active participant in ranch operations, teaching his grandchildren the lessons he had learned over half a century of working the land. He and Beatrice spent more time together than they had in years, rediscovering the pleasure of simple companionship that had first drawn them together. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1934, surrounded by 3 generations of family. The small ranch house had been expanded over the years into a sprawling complex that could accommodate the entire family when they gathered for holidays and celebrations. Thomas and Emily had 6 children, Sarah and her husband had 4, and Daniel, who had married a teacher he met in Tucson, had 3 of his own. The yard was full of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a testament to the love that Xavier and Beatrice had built their lives upon. At the anniversary celebration, Xavier stood before the assembled family and raised his glass in a toast. 50 years ago, I married the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman I have ever known, he said, his voice still strong despite his years. She came to the frontier with nothing but hope and determination, and she built a home not just for me but for all of us. Every person standing here is a testament to her courage and her love. Beatrice stood beside him, tears streaming down her face, surrounded by the family she had created and the life she had built. I came to Arizona thinking I was seeking land and independence, she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. But what I found was so much more than that. I found a partner who saw me as an equal, a love that sustained me through every challenge, a home in the truest sense of the word. Xavier told me once that I was the home he had been seeking, but he has been my home as well, every single day for 50 years. The celebration lasted into the night, with music and dancing and storytelling, the family sharing memories and creating new ones. As the stars came out and the younger children were carried off to bed, Xavier and Beatrice found themselves alone on their porch once more, the place where so much of their life together had unfolded. 50 years, Xavier said wonderingly. Where did the time go? Into building this, Beatrice said, gesturing at the house full of family, the land stretching out around them. Into creating something that matters, something that will continue long after we are gone. No regrets, Xavier asked, taking her hand. Not a single one, Beatrice said firmly. Well, perhaps one very small regret that I did not bring warmer clothes when I first arrived, but everything else, every moment, every challenge, every joy, I would not change any of it. Xavier laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet desert night. I love you, Beatrice Zimmerman. I loved you then, I love you now, and I will love you forever. And I love you, Xavier, she said. You are still the home I have been seeking, even after 50 years of being found. They remained on the porch long after the lights in the house had dimmed, and the sounds of the celebration had faded to silence. They sat together as they had so many times before. 2 people who had found in each other something rare and precious, a love that had transformed not just their own lives but the lives of everyone around them. Xavier Zimmerman passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1938, at the age of 83. He died in the bed he had shared with Beatrice for 56 years, in the house they had made a home together, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. Beatrice was beside him when he took his last breath, holding his hand and whispering words of love into his ear. They buried him on the hillside next to his mother and Tom Briggs, overlooking the valley he had loved so well. The entire community turned out for the funeral, ranchers and townspeople, family and friends, all coming to pay their respects to a man who had embodied the best qualities of the frontier spirit: honesty, hard work, loyalty, and love. Beatrice stood at the grave with her children beside her, 3 generations of family gathered to mourn and remember. She did not cry, though her heart felt like it was breaking. Instead, she spoke of the man she had loved for more than half her life, of his kindness and strength, his integrity and his humor, his fierce dedication to family and land. "He told me once that I was the home he had been seeking," Beatrice said, her voice steady though her eyes shone with unshed tears. "But what he gave me was so much more than a home. He gave me a life of meaning and purpose. He gave me love that sustained me through every challenge. He gave me a family and a legacy that will continue long after we are both gone. And he gave me the certainty that I was loved completely and unconditionally, every single day we shared together." After the funeral, Beatrice returned to the ranch house that felt emptier without Xavier's presence, but still held the echoes of their life together. She was 79 years old, and everyone expected her to slow down, perhaps to move into town or to live with one of her children. But Beatrice had not survived the frontier by being weak or giving up when things got hard. She remained on the ranch, working alongside Thomas and Daniel to continue building what she and Xavier had started. She spent her days helping Sarah with her school, teaching her granddaughters the skills they would need to thrive in a changing world, and writing down the stories of their life together so that future generations would know where they came from. On quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch alone, watching the sun set over the desert and remembering. She remembered a frozen December day in 1882, when she had tumbled out of a stagecoach into the mud of Gila City, desperate and afraid and hoping for a miracle. She remembered a tall cowboy with lonely eyes who had offered her kindness when he had no reason to. She remembered falling in love slowly and then all at once, discovering in Xavier Zimmerman a partner and equal, a love that had transformed her entire world. Beatrice Zimmerman passed away quietly in her sleep in the fall of 1940, at the age of 81. Her children found her in the morning, lying peacefully in the bed she had shared with Xavier, a slight smile on her face as if she was dreaming of something beautiful. On her bedside table was her mother's Bible and a photograph of Xavier, taken on their wedding day, when they had been young and full of hope and certain that together they could face anything. They buried her beside Xavier on the hillside, and the family gathered once more to remember and mourn. But there was joy mixed with the sadness, because everyone knew that Beatrice and Xavier were together again, reunited in whatever came after this life, still finding in each other the home they had always been seeking. The ranch continued, passed down through generations of Zimmermans who worked the land and raised their families, and honored the legacy of the brave woman and the lonely cowboy who had built it all from nothing but love and determination. The house remained standing, expanded and improved over the years, but still recognizable as the place where Xavier and Beatrice had created their life together. And on quiet spring evenings, when the desert bloomed with wildflowers and the air was soft and warm, if you stood on that porch and listened carefully, you might almost hear the echo of their voices, talking and laughing and sharing the comfortable silence of two people who knew they were exactly where they belonged. You might feel the presence of a love so strong it had transformed not just 2 lives but generations of lives, creating a legacy that would endure as long as the desert itself. Winter had brought her to the frontier, but it was love that made her stay. And in staying, in building a life with a lonely cowboy who saw her as the home he had been seeking, Beatrice Ashford Zimmerman had found not just survival but true and lasting joy. She had found purpose and meaning, family and belonging, and a love that transcended time and mortality. Their story became part of the folklore of Gila City, passed down through generations as an example of what the frontier could offer to those brave enough to seek it. It was a story of courage and determination, of finding love in unexpected places, of building something lasting from the raw materials of hope and hard work. It was a story that reminded people that home was not just a place but a person, and that the greatest adventures sometimes began with the simple act of offering kindness to a stranger in need. And so the legacy of Xavier and Beatrice Zimmerman lived on, in the land they had worked, in the family they had created, in the love they had shared. They had faced the challenges of the frontier together and had emerged victorious, not because they were stronger than others, but because they had been stronger together. They had found in each other the missing piece that made them complete, the home that made everywhere they went together feel like the right place to be. The winter that brought Beatrice to the frontier had been harsh and unforgiving, but it had also brought her to Xavier, and in finding him, she had found everything she had ever needed. And when Xavier told her, "You are the home I have been seeking," he had spoken a truth that would remain constant through all the years of their life together and beyond, a truth that defined their love and their legacy. That home was not a place but a person, and that person was each other, now and always and forever.